Alright, so here we're going to graph with the amplitude and period change, but this time in radians, so we're using pi's. Same setup, opposite of what we're doing with that number, and y times that number. So we are going to actually have x over 2, and then we are actually going to have y over 2 on this side as well. And so start off with 0. 0 over 2 is 0. Pi over 2 over 2 divided by 2 is pi over 4. Pi divided by 2 is pi over 2. 3 pi over 2 divided by 2 is 3 pi over 4. And 2 pi over 2 is just pi. And so now our y values is going to be, since it's sine, we're starting at 0. 0 times a half is 0. 1 times a half is a half. 0 times a half is 0. Negative 1 times a half is negative 1 half. And 0 divided by 2 is 0. So there it is. So now we just have to plot this. And again, it's really easy. You go 0. We end at pi. Halfway is pi over 2. Halfway here is pi over 4. And halfway here is 3 pi over 4. And the highest we go is 1 half. Lowest we go is negative 1 half. And now you plot your points. So we've got 0, 0, pi over 4 to 1 half, then 0, 0 to negative 1 half, and then back to 0. And we connect the dots with our curve. And there you go, completed. Okay, so over here we analyze, we're dividing by 3 here and multiplying by 2 here with the amplitude. So therefore, we're going to have 3 times the x's and 2 times the y's. And so here, 0 times 3 is 0. Pi over 2 times 3 is 3 pi over 2. Pi times 3 is 3 pi. 3 pi over 2 is 9 pi over 2. And 2 pi times 3 is 6 pi. Now, since it's sine, you start at 0. 0 times 2 is 0. 1 times 2 is 2. 0 times 2 is 0. 2 times negative 1 is negative 2. 0 times 2 is 0. And now set up your scale. 0, 6 pi, 3 pi, 3 pi over 2, 9 pi over 2, and we go all the way up to 2 and down to negative 2, and now plot your points. 0, 0, up to 2, back to 0, down to negative 2, back to 0, and draw your curve. And there's your answer. Okay, so looking at 9, analyzing here, dividing by 2 here, and taking a half or dividing 2 on the y's. So we are going to get double the x's and take half of the y's. So 0 times 2 is 0. Pi over 2 times 2 is pi. Pi times 2 is 2 pi. 3 pi over 2 times 2 is 3 pi. And 2 pi times 2 is 4 pi. Because it's sine, you're starting at 0. 0 divided by 2 is 0. 1 divided by 2 is 1 half. 0, negative 1 half, and then 0. So here we go. Set your scale. Starting at 0, we're going to 4 pi. Halfway is 2 pi. Halfway here is pi. Halfway here is 3 pi. The highest we go is 1 half. The lowest we go is negative 1 half. And plot your point. 0, 0 to 1 half to 0 to negative 1 half back to 0. Draw your curve and you're all done. Okay, so if you can complete the table, everything else is very, hopefully very simple. We just have to make sure we can make the table. Okay, so here we have a 3 here, 3 there. So that means our x's are going to be divisible by 3, and our y's are going to be times 3. So starting off, 0 divided by 3 is 0. Then pi over 2 divided by 3 is going to be pi over 6. Pi divided by 3 is going to be pi over 3. 3 pi over 2 divided by 3 is going to be actually pi over 2. Because 3 pi over 2 times 1/3 is 3 pi over 6. And that leads you to pi over 2. And then 2 pi divided by 3 is going to be 2 pi over 3. So now our y values, we're at cosine, so we're starting at 1. 1 times 3 is 3. 0 times 3 is 0. Negative 1 times 3 is negative 3. 0 times 3 is 0. 1 times 3 is 3. So now set our scale, 0. We're going all the way to 2 pi over 3. Halfway in between is pi over 3. Halfway between is pi over 6. Halfway between is pi over 2. And the highest we go is 3. Lowest we go is negative 3. And so 0, 3 to 0, down to negative 3 to 0, up to positive 3. And draw your curve. Okay? So if you make the table, like I said, all you got to do is set everything up and then put your points in and draw the curve. Okay? 11, to do our analysis here, dividing by 4 there, multiplying by a half, or dividing by 2 there. So here we're going to get 4 times the x's, and then the y's are going to be divided by 2. So 4 times the x's, 0 times 4 is 0. Pi over 2 times 4 is 2 pi. Pi times 4 is 4 pi. 3 pi over 2 times 4 is 6 pi. And 2 pi times 4 is 8 pi. Since it's cosine, you're starting at the top. 1 divided by 2 is 1/2. 0 divided by 2 is 0. Negative 1 divided by 2 is negative 1/2. 0 divided by 2 is 0. And 1 divided by 2 is 1/2. So now, set your scale. We got 0 to 8 pi. Halfway is 4 pi. Halfway is 2 pi. And halfway is 6 pi. And it goes up to 1/2. And it goes down to negative 1/2. And now plot your points. 0, 1/2. Then down to 0. To negative 1/2. To 0. Back to 1/2, and connect the dots, drawing it as a curve. Don't draw it as a V, because that would be absolute value function. Okay, make sure it curves. So now the last one, we got times 3 here, times 2 here, which changes to, we have the x's divided by 3, and the y's times 2. So at 10 we did x over 3, so if we just copy those down, 0, pi over 6, pi over 3, pi over 2, and 2 pi over 3, we're set. Now double the y's, it's sine, so we start at 0. 0 times 2 is 0, 1 times 2 is 2, 0 times 2 is 0. Negative 1, excuse me. Negative 1 times 2 is negative 2, and 0 times 0 is 0. So, set your scale. We're at 0. We end up at 2 pi over 3. Halfway is pi over 3. Halfway between those is pi over 6. And halfway between those is pi over 2. When we go up to 2, we go down to negative 2. And we plot 0, 0. Up to 2, back down to negative 2, back up, and we draw that curve, and you're good to go. And so that is your amplitude and period change based upon radian.